I want to take a minute and walk through an idea that's a part of this struggle. And it was a place where the disciples had a great deal of difficulty. And if they had difficulty, Jesus recruited them. They did a pretty remarkable job of sharing the Jesus story with their world. Is that a fair statement? And yet, this was one point where it seems to me that they really wrestled to get their brains around the allegiance between Jesus in their lives and what that meant and the other commitments of their lives. And I think we struggle with that as well. In Luke chapter 13, Jesus is entering Jerusalem. Jesus didn't live in Jerusalem. His ministry was not based out of Jerusalem. He visited Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the epicenter of Israelite life in the first century. The temple was there. It's the national bank. It's the point of national identification. The people are directed to go there 3 times a year to worship. The Herod's temple is one of the wonders of the ancient world, but Jesus chose a sleepy little fishing village on the shores of Galilee. But he visits Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will be the center of the conflict he has with the power brokers because he is threatening them. In Luke 13, he's entering Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you, how often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, Jesus is the greatest of all the Hebrew prophets, greater than Isaiah or Jeremiah or whomever you might put at the top of that list in your imagination. And Jesus is speaking about the future of Jerusalem. Did you hear him? Luke heard him. Peter, James, and John heard him. It wasn't lost to them. He said, your house will be left to you desolate. Desolate is a fancy word for empty. There won't be anybody left here. You have persecuted the prophets. He said, it wasn't my choice for you. I wanted to gather you together like a hen would gather her chicks, but you wouldn't have it. And now your house will be left to you desolate. They're not idle words. They're not complicated. It's not a one-time statement. Same chapter. In fact, I've used the same author for this because I wanted you to see Luke is presenting to us a theme of Jesus' ministry. Luke 19, as he approached Jerusalem and he saw the city, this is his triumphal entry. We celebrate that on Palm Sunday. This victorious day of Jesus coming into the city of Jerusalem as a conquering king. As he approached the city, what did he do? He wept over it. He said, if even you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you didn't recognize the time of God's coming to you. Again, this is the greatest of all the Hebrew prophets. His friends are there that day. They've heard what he said. It's recounted in multiple gospels. This isn't some side story. It's not incidental. What Jesus is describing is the siege of the city. It would have been very apparent to them. It was the most common means of warfare in the first century. If an attacking army came to a city, Jerusalem was a walled city. You would deploy your troops around the city. You wouldn't allow anybody to come in or to go out. You would starve them into submission. And it's what Jesus described. He said, your enemies will build an embankment against you the weakest points in the wall of the city were either the gates, because they were typically made of wood or metal. They could be burned or they could be battered open, or they would pick some part of the wall that was the most approachable. And you would build an earthen ramp up to it so you could push a siege engine, something to batter the wall, a battering ram, up the earthen ramp so you could batter the wall. If I could take you to the Mount of Olives today, and we could stand on that hill looking westward at the city of Jerusalem, there's the Kidron Valley, and then there's the wall of the Temple Mount, the retaining wall of Herod's Temple Mount from Jesus' day. And about half of it is covered. There's a Muslim cemetery there, but it's built in what remains of the Roman siege wall, the earthen wall that the Romans built up against the foundation of Herod's temple. They came in 70 AD and fulfilled what Jesus said. If we put it in contemporary language, he said the missiles will rain down on your city. The drones will drop bombs. The enemy will murder the children in the streets of your city. It's what Jesus said to them. He has spoken a prophecy over the city of Jerusalem. He's told them their future. The disciples are present. They even ask some follow-up questions in private. I didn't put them all in your notes. When they walk away from this presentation, they say to him, tell us when this is going to happen. We want to know the timing. And he tells them. He gives them the timeline. But clearly they don't understand, or they can't comprehend the magnitude of what they're being told. This is a little easier for us following them through the narrative because they haven't been able to comprehend what he said about his own betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion and resurrection, right? He's told them multiple times and they're just a bit addled, confused. Well, he's told them about the future of Jerusalem and they're going, no. We believe you're the Messiah. We've been waiting for you to come. You're the difference maker, the King. Look at all these people worshiping you. And Jesus begins to weep, and he said, they're going to destroy this city. Not because they're wicked, not because the Roman legions are stronger than the defenses of Jerusalem. They're going to destroy you because you didn't recognize God's presence in your midst. The issue isn't the strength of the enemy. The strength is the problem in the hearts of God's people. Again, it is not a lack of information for the disciples. It's a struggle to imagine God's power and purposes being implemented. They want to understand the world in terms of Romans and Jews and military power and legions. And Jesus is saying to them, there's some power far greater than a Roman legion in front of you. Don't you remember? I spoke to the wind and the waves, and I opened a blind eye, or I raised a young man in the middle of a funeral. And the answer is no, they can't assimilate all of that. They know the law of Moses. They know the Sabbath rules. They know the kosher rules. They know the rules around sacrifice and Passover and Sukkot. But they're struggling to assimilate what Jesus is saying. So now I want to ask you a question. Let's step out of the first century and step into the 21st century. Can we imagine a God who brings judgment upon nations? Or do you think that's only a biblical thing? Do you think that's just something historical? Something in antiquity because they weren't sophisticated enough to understand military technology. And then when military technology progressed, new empires emerged. It had nothing to do with God. Oh, really? Is that what we believe as the people of God? Or do we believe that God brings judgment upon nations? Do we believe God would bring judgment upon our nation? It's a very important question for us. You see, God deals with us as individuals. Well, I believe in that. I believe in personal salvation. But I also believe that it is equally a biblical truth that God brings judgment upon nations. And the awkwardness of that is that when that happens, the righteous suffer as well. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem, a godly man. God said, I knew you when you were knit together in your mother's womb. I had an assignment for you before you ever made your first sound. And Jeremiah went into captivity with the exiles. And he's not the only one. He just happens to be one that we know. Again, do we have the imagination that what the Scripture tells us about is a part of our world? Or have we peeled out the verses that we like that cause us to think happy thoughts about happy places, and then we don't have to identify as Christ followers because it doesn't really make any difference. Our future is determined by Wall Street or the Federal Reserve or the United Nations or NATO or whatever else we put our faith in. God deals with us as individuals. But the biblical principle is that he brings judgment upon nations, the godly and the ungodly. 721, the Assyrians conquered the nation of Israel, the northern nation, the 10 tribes. About 150 years later, 587 BC, it's not in your notes, but it is in the history books, I promise. 587, the Babylonians marched their armies across the desert sands and besieged Jerusalem, destroyed the first temple, Solomon's temple, took some of the brightest and best of the young people of Israel with them back to Babylon. We call that period the exile. It was God's judgment upon his people. It had little to do with Babylonian military might. God's demonstrated over and over again his ability to turn back armies that had technological superiority and numerical superiority to the people of Israel. Think about Gideon. Gideon and a relatively handful of people with trumpets and clay pots defeated an army numbered in the tens of thousands. And a part of the vulnerability of God's people is we recite over and over and over again the triumphs, the victory stories, and the deliverances, and we do not listen to the words of Jesus. He said to his closest friends, the Romans are coming, and you will not be able to defend yourselves. Is that fair? Is that what he said? Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, within 40 years of Jesus saying that. 5 Roman legions marched. They came from Europe. They came from throughout the empire because you couldn't afford a rebellion on the edge of the empire right next to Persia. It couldn't be tolerated. It was a vulnerability that couldn't be accepted. And Jerusalem was destroyed. 60 years later, there was a second war, a second uprising, the Bar Kokhba. And in 130, this time the Romans had had enough. They wanted to separate the Jewish presence from Jerusalem. They forbid the Jews to stay in the city of Jerusalem. They renamed it. They corrupted the word for the Philistines, and they called it Palestine. That's where we got to Palestine until today. The Jews had been in Jerusalem for more than 1,000 years before the Romans called it Palestine. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. You know the drill. Hit the bell for notifications. If you want to, leave a comment.